They say some families welcome you with open arms. Mine welcomed me with a prenuptial agreement, a condescending smile, and a quiet but unmistakable warning that I would never truly belong. I spent 6 years trying to prove them wrong. It took me exactly 48 hours in a hospital bed to realize I had been wasting my time. 6 days after emergency surgery that nearly cost me my life, my father-in-law walked into my recovery room carrying a leather briefcase, a bottle of sparkling water he did not offer to share, and a certified cashier's check for $18 million. My husband stood behind him near the door, studying his shoes with the intensity of a man who had rehearsed his cowardice all morning. My sister-in-law leaned against the windowsill with her arms crossed, wearing a smile so thin it barely qualified as one. She had always been the sharpest blade in that family's drawer, and today she wanted to make sure I felt every inch of it. My father-in-law set the check on my meal tray the way you might set down a tip for a waitress you found merely adequate. He did not say hello. He did not ask how the incision was healing or whether the pain medication was working. He simply looked at me with the quiet certainty of a man who had never once been told no and said, "We've had our attorneys prepare everything, the divorce papers, the asset separation agreement, and a non-disclosure contract. Sign all three, take the check, and we would like you gone from the property by the end of the month." My husband finally looked up from the floor. "It's a generous offer," he said, which was the most words he had spoken to me in 2 weeks. I looked at the check resting beside my hospital cup of lukewarm broth. $18 million. It was printed in clean black ink with the kind of precision that suggested someone had rehearsed the number before writing it. I am a forensic data analyst. For 7 years, I have made my living by finding the things people desperately do not want found. Hidden transactions, falsified records, numbers that tell a very different story once you know where to look. I am trained to stay completely calm when I already know the ending of a story someone else thinks they are still writing. So I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I picked up the check, turned it over once in my hands, and said, "This is a very specific number." My father-in-law lifted one eyebrow. "It is a very generous number." "It's curious," I replied, keeping my voice as flat and even as a balance sheet. Because the last time I reviewed the quarterly audit on the Pacific Holdings subsidiary, $18 million was the precise figure sitting in an investor escrow account that your company has been quietly borrowing from for the past 3 years, without disclosure. The room went entirely silent. My sister-in-law uncrossed her arms. My husband dropped his phone. My father-in-law did not flinch, because men like him have spent their entire lives training their faces not to flinch. But his left hand tightened around the leather handle of his briefcase, and I noticed. I always noticed. "You have 2 choices," he said, and his voice had lost the easy warmth it started with. "You take the money and you disappear, or you walk away from this marriage with nothing and spend the next 5 years in litigation with attorneys who have been billing $300 an hour since before you were born. You do not have the resources to fight this family, and you do not have the credibility. You are a woman who was in elective surgery during a marriage that was clearly already failing. My attorneys will make sure that narrative is the only one anyone hears. It was not elective surgery. It was an emergency appendectomy. But I did not correct him, because I had already decided this conversation was not actually about surgery. I would like the funds transferred directly," I said, "not a cashier's check. Wire it to my personal account tonight, irrevocable and cleared." My sister-in-law let out a small, satisfied laugh. She thought my asking for a wire transfer meant I was surrendering. She had never understood the difference between a woman who is afraid and a woman who is buying herself time. My father-in-law pulled out his phone, dialed his private financial manager, and authorized the transfer without blinking. He rattled off my account number, which his people had clearly already obtained, and gave the instruction with the calm efficiency of a man closing a real estate deal. He believed he was purchasing my silence. He did not understand that he was handing me the exact instrument I needed to dismantle the empire he had spent 30 years building. He set a thick envelope on the tray, beside the now empty space where the check had been. "Sign the divorce agreement and the non-disclosure. My attorney will notarize everything before we leave." I reached for the pen he offered. I signed the last page of the document he slid across the tray, and I handed it back to him. My father-in-law examined the signature with the practiced eye of a man who had closed hundreds of contracts. He nodded once, tucked the folder under his arm, and turned to leave. "I'll have someone from the house send your personal items," my husband said from the doorway. He did not look at me when he said it. My sister-in-law paused on her way out, her hand resting on the doorframe. She looked at me one last time with an expression that lived somewhere between pity and triumph. "You're smarter than I expected," she said. "To just take the money and not make a scene." "I've always been smarter than you expected," I replied. She closed the door. I waited until I heard the elevator chime at the end of the hall. Then I reached under my pillow and pulled out my personal phone, the one my father-in-law's investigators did not know existed, the one I had been using for the past 8 months to document everything. My best friend answered before the second ring. She had been a federal attorney for 4 years, and she had been my closest friend since college. She was also the only person in the world who had known what I was building long before tonight. "The wire cleared?" she asked immediately. "Cleared and confirmed," I said. 18 million, liquid, in my name. I heard her exhale slowly. "And the document?" "He signed the one I put in the envelope," I said. "Not the one his attorneys drafted." There was a pause, and then she laughed, low and deliberate. "Your father-in-law just authorized an irrevocable financial gift to an independent holding company you established in Delaware. Signed, notarized, and already filed with the county clerk's office as of 40 minutes ago," I said. "He brought his own notary. That was considerate of him." I had spent 2 months working with my best friend to prepare for exactly this moment. The document my father-in-law signed was not a divorce settlement or a non-disclosure agreement. It was a legal transfer of interest, authorizing the release of $18 million to a private entity that I controlled entirely. His attorneys had never seen it. His notary had only checked that the signatures appeared on the correct lines. My father-in-law, a man who had dismissed me as a middle-class accountant, unworthy of his family name, had been too arrogant to read what he was actually signing. "How long before he figures it out?" my best friend asked. "His attorney will catch it by morning," I said, "which gives us about 7 hours. Then we move now," she said. "Can you walk?" I had been walking carefully since day 3 of my recovery, which the nursing staff had encouraged, and my father-in-law had clearly not accounted for. "I can walk," I said. 30 minutes later, I was dressed. My discharge paperwork had been quietly expedited by a night shift physician my best friend had already spoken to, and I was being helped into a private car waiting at the service entrance on the lower level of the building. I did not use the main lobby. I did not pass the front desk. I left no forwarding information with the hospital. By the time my father-in-law's attorney called the following morning to report a catastrophic irregularity in the signed documentation, I was already in a private apartment 2 cities away, sitting at a clean desk with dual monitors, a pot of dark coffee, and 8 months of financial evidence that I had been waiting to use. The story my father-in-law told the world over the next 72 hours was a polished, expensive lie. He had deep relationships with 3 regional business journalists and a local television anchor who had attended his charity gala every autumn for the past decade. By noon on the day after I left the hospital, a carefully constructed narrative began appearing across local news outlets and real estate industry blogs. According to the story his communications team placed, I had suffered a psychological breakdown following surgery, had made erratic financial demands, and had walked out of the hospital against medical advice in a state of delusion, taking with me assets that rightfully belonged to the family trust. My husband gave a brief statement outside their downtown office building. He looked tired and genuinely sad, which I suspected was less about me and more about the fact that the woman he had been seeing for the past 11 months worked 2 floors below him and was now the subject of significant office speculation. He said he hoped I would get the help I needed. He said the family's priority was ensuring stability during a difficult time. My sister-in-law did not speak publicly, which meant she was working the phones privately. She had always been the more dangerous of the 2 of them. I watched all of this from my apartment without touching a single public platform. My best friend had advised me to stay completely silent on social media, and I had listened. Every instinct I had screamed at me to release the financial records immediately, and let the evidence speak for itself. She told me to wait. She told me the trap needed more pressure before it would fully close. The thing about forensic data analysis is that the work is rarely dramatic. It is mostly quiet, methodical, and deeply unglamorous. For 8 months before my hospitalization, I had been documenting a pattern of financial conduct within my father-in-law's company that crossed well past the line of aggressive accounting into territory that federal regulators had a specific name for. The Pacific Holdings subsidiary that I had mentioned in the hospital room was not a careless slip. It was a thread I had been pulling on since the previous spring, when I noticed a discrepancy in a quarterly report my husband had left open on the shared home printer. My father-in-law's company had been treating a restricted investor escrow account as a personal line of credit. The $18 million he had offered me did not belong to him. It belonged to 47 individual investors who had placed capital in a mixed-use development fund with the expectation that their money was sitting securely in a segregated account. It had not been sitting. It had been circulating quietly through a series of internal transfers, funding personal projects, covering operating shortfalls, and occasionally reappearing just long enough to satisfy routine audits before moving again. He had stolen from his own investors to try to buy my silence. The symmetry was almost elegant. My best friend filed the federal disclosure package on a Thursday morning. The Securities and Exchange Commission received it at 8:47. The Financial Industry Regulatory Authority received a parallel submission at 9:15. The United States Attorney's Office for the district received a sealed evidence packet compiled across 8 months of documented transactions at 9:30. By 11 o'clock, 2 federal agents had appeared at my father-in-law's office building to request documents. I found out about their arrival not from a news alert, but from a phone call. My sister-in-law called me for the first time in 3 years. She did not start with a greeting. "What did you do?" she said. It was not a question. "I filed accurate financial disclosures with the appropriate regulatory bodies," I said. "You just burned down everything," she said. "I documented the fire that was already burning," I replied. "I simply made sure the right people had the evidence to see it." She called me several things after that, none of which I will repeat, and then she hung up. I imagined she spent the next hour calling attorneys. Her father had always been the source of her financial security, and she had never once built anything independently. She had been waiting for her inheritance with the quiet patience of someone who never considered that an inheritance could be seized before it arrived. The news cycle turned violent by afternoon. The story my father-in-law's communications team had placed about my supposed breakdown was now competing directly with breaking financial reporting about a federal inquiry into Pacific Holdings. Journalists who had printed his carefully crafted narrative about a troubled daughter-in-law were now scrambling to reconcile that story with the documentation my best friend had made available through proper legal channels. My best friend called me at 2 in the afternoon with an update. "His attorneys are trying to reach you directly," she said. "They want to discuss a settlement." "Tell them I'm unavailable," I said. "They're also trying to argue that the document he signed was obtained fraudulently." "They're welcome to make that argument in front of a judge," I said, while simultaneously explaining to the SEC why $18 million of investor funds were used to make a personal payment in the middle of a federal inquiry. There was a pause. "You're enjoying this," she said. "I am a forensic data analyst," I said. "I enjoy accurate outcomes." The following 48 hours were not quiet, but they moved with a kind of mathematical inevitability that I had calculated for long enough that each step felt less like chaos and more like confirmation. The $18 million in my holding company account had already been deployed. While my father-in-law was managing his media narrative and my husband was canceling golf reservations, I had instructed a network of proxy buyers to acquire shares in the parent company through the open market. His company had been publicly traded for 11 years, and the federal inquiry news had sent institutional investors running. Shares that had been trading comfortably were now priced at a level that made them extraordinarily attractive to someone sitting on $18 million in liquid capital. My best friend had identified the legal structure 6 months earlier. We had prepared the proxy acquisition entities in Delaware before I was ever hospitalized. Everything was ready. All it required was capital and timing. My father-in-law had provided both. By the close of market on Friday, I held a significant position in the company his own father had started in 1987. The board meeting happened on a Monday. It had been called as an emergency session to address the federal inquiry, stabilize investor relations, and determine whether the company's leadership could weather the regulatory pressure without a change in structure. My father-in-law arrived assuming he would spend the morning reassuring anxious board members and committing to compliance reforms. He arrived in the suit he wore to every major meeting, the one his wife had given him for their 30th anniversary, with his attorney on his left and his chief financial officer on his right. He did not expect to see me seated at the table. I had arrived 20 minutes early. My best friend sat beside me. The board members who had been briefed by our legal team in the preceding 48 hours were already in their chairs. The ones who had not been briefed yet looked confused when they walked in. The confusion did not last long. My father-in-law stopped walking when he saw me. His attorney placed a hand on his arm and said something quietly. My father-in-law shook the hand off. "You have no standing to be in this room," he said. "I'm a shareholder," I said. "I have both standing and a seat." I indicated the chair I was sitting in. "You are not a shareholder," he said. My best friend slid a copy of the certified shareholder registry across the polished table toward the senior board member seated to her left. "She became a shareholder of record as of Friday at market close," my best friend said. The relevant SEC filings were submitted simultaneously with the acquisition. Everything is fully compliant and documentable. My father-in-law sat down. He sat down very slowly, the way a person does when their legs are working but their mind is still catching up. He looked at the registry. He looked at the percentage beside my holding company's name. Then he looked at me. "You used my money," he said. "You transferred it irrevocably," I said, "per the document you signed and notarized." "That document was fraudulent," he said. "That argument would be more persuasive," my best friend said pleasantly, "if the document hadn't been signed in front of your own notary, by your own hand, and filed with the county clerk within the hour. But you are welcome to make that argument publicly while simultaneously facing a federal inquiry for misappropriating investor funds. We'll let the court decide which issue receives more attention." The senior board member had been reading the shareholder registry. He set it down on the table and looked at my father-in-law with the expression of a man who had just finished calculating how much money he had personally lost in the past 4 trading days. "The position she holds," he said carefully, "combined with the outstanding share distribution, places her in a materially significant ownership position. She holds enough to matter," my best friend confirmed. My father-in-law turned to the room. He had spent 3 decades managing rooms like this. He knew how to read the temperature of a board meeting and shift it. He had done it in downturns, in lawsuits, in regulatory disputes. He was very good at it. But the board members who looked back at him now were not the allies they had been 6 months ago. The federal inquiry had changed the calculation for all of them. Every man in that room had a fiduciary responsibility to the company and to the shareholders who were currently watching their investment erode. My father-in-law had been the source of value for 30 years. He was now the source of liability. "I built this company," my father-in-law said. "I built it from a single property in 1987, and I turned it into what it is today. You do not walk in here and take what I built." "I'm not taking anything," I said. "I purchased shares on the open market at a fair price. Everything I did was legal, documented, and fully disclosed. I can say that with confidence. Can you say the same about the Pacific Holdings account?" The silence that followed was the kind that precedes a structural shift. I had heard it once before, during an audit where a CFO realized midway through a deposition that every answer he gave was being measured against records he didn't know existed. My father-in-law's attorney leaned over and spoke quietly in his ear. My father-in-law listened with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the table. When the attorney finished, my father-in-law looked up at the board. "I would like a brief recess," he said. The senior board member shook his head. "I don't think a recess is appropriate given the nature of the pending federal matter and the time-sensitive nature of the shareholder situation," he said. "I think we need to address both issues this morning." What followed was not a dramatic confrontation so much as a methodical unwinding. Board members asked questions. My best friend provided documentation. My father-in-law's attorney objected and withdrew the objections in quick succession, as each piece of evidence rendered them untenable. My husband had not come to the meeting, which told me his own attorney had already advised him to create distance from his father's legal exposure. By the time the board voted on an emergency resolution to separate the company's operational leadership from the individuals under federal scrutiny, it was not even noon. My father-in-law left the building through a side exit. I know this because the building's security log, which I now had access to as a significant shareholder, showed his badge deactivated at 11:53. I did not pursue him down the hallway. I did not need a final conversation. I had said everything I needed to say with filing dates and account numbers. My sister-in-law called me again that evening. This time, her voice was different. The sharp edges were gone, replaced by something flatter and more tired. "What happens to us now?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. She had been complicit. She had stood in my hospital room smiling while her father offered me money to disappear. She had helped shape the media narrative afterward. But she was also a person who had spent her entire adult life measuring her worth against an inheritance that was now entangled in a federal investigation, and I recognized what that kind of dependency produced in people. "That depends entirely on what you do next," I said. "If you cooperate fully with the regulatory inquiry and stop attempting to protect your father's position, the investigators will have no particular interest in you. If you try to interfere or suppress documentation, that changes." "And the company?" she asked. "The board will make decisions about the company's leadership structure," I said. "That process will be transparent and compliant." She was quiet for a moment. "You planned all of this," she said, "even before the hospital." "I documented what I found," I said. "What your father chose to do with that information was always up to him." She hung up without saying goodbye. I did not sell my shares immediately. I held them through the regulatory process, attended board meetings, and participated in the compliance restructuring that the federal inquiry ultimately required. My father-in-law entered a negotiated agreement with the Department of Justice 6 months later. The terms required full restitution to the 47 investors in the Pacific Holdings Fund, a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company, and a substantial financial penalty. He avoided criminal prosecution by cooperating with investigators and surrendering assets. My husband filed for divorce through his attorney, citing irreconcilable differences. He requested a division of marital assets that his attorney had clearly prepared before realizing the full scope of my financial position, and then quietly revised to something considerably more modest once the revised picture became clear. The final settlement was fair. I did not try to punish him beyond what the law provided. He was a weak man who had let his father make decisions for him his entire life, and I suspected the years ahead would be punishment enough. My sister-in-law eventually took a position with a smaller development firm in another city. She sent me a brief professional message about a year later, noting that she had started a project independently, without family backing. I replied briefly and wished her well. I meant it. 11 months after the board meeting, on a gray Tuesday morning with rain coming sideways off the Pacific, I sat at the same clean desk in the same apartment, with the same dual monitors and a better coffee setup, and I looked at the numbers that had been accumulating steadily in accounts I controlled entirely. I was 32 years old. I had no mortgage. I had no toxic alliances. I had no one standing in a doorway studying their shoes, while someone else tried to purchase my dignity. I had rebuilt my consulting practice into something I was genuinely proud of. I took clients carefully. I turned down engagements where the leadership asked questions that suggested they wanted me to find only the problems they had already approved of finding. The clients I kept were the ones who wanted the truth regardless of where it led, and I charged them accordingly. My best friend and I had dinner every few weeks. She had taken on 2 significant federal whistleblower cases in the aftermath of our work together, and her practice had grown considerably. We did not spend much time talking about my father-in-law, or the settlement, or the board meeting. We talked about her cases, my clients, the book she was writing, and a property on the coast that I was considering purchasing and that she thought I should purchase immediately before I talked myself out of it. I bought the property. I want to say something directly to anyone who is watching this and recognizes something familiar in the way I was treated in that hospital room. Because I know that the mechanics of my situation, the federal filings, and the proxy acquisitions and the share registry are not something most people have access to. The specific tools I used were specific to my circumstances, but the principle underneath all of it is not. What my father-in-law was counting on, what people like him always count on, is that you will be too exhausted, too destabilized, and too afraid to think clearly in the moment they choose to confront you. They pick the hospital room deliberately. They pick the moment after the surgery, after the miscarriage, after the layoff, after the loss, because they believe vulnerability translates directly into compliance. They believe that if they can catch you when you feel small enough, you will make decisions that benefit them before your own thinking recovers. The thing they cannot account for is preparation. I did not walk into that hospital room empty-handed. I had spent 8 months watching, documenting, and building something that had nothing to do with the confrontation they planned, and everything to do with the one I had been quietly preparing for. I did not know exactly when they would come or exactly what they would offer, but I understood the structure of their thinking well enough to anticipate the shape of it. You do not have to be a forensic data analyst to do this. You have to be willing to study the situation you are in with the same clarity you would bring to any other problem that required a solution. You have to stop waiting for the people who are harming you to suddenly decide to stop, and start asking yourself what an honest assessment of your options actually looks like. Toxic people with money and influence rely on two things: your emotional reaction and your belief that they are too powerful to challenge. Take away your emotional reaction and begin examining their actual structural weaknesses, and the picture changes considerably. My father-in-law was not untouchable. He had spent 30 years believing he was, and that belief had made him sloppy in ways that were thoroughly documented and entirely his own fault. He handed me the evidence. He handed me the capital, and he signed the instrument of his own financial consequence in front of his own notary because he was too certain of his power to read what was in front of him. I am not telling you this story because I want you to admire the cleverness of it. I am telling you this story because I want you to understand that the thing standing between you and your own version of this outcome is not intelligence, and it is not money, and it is not connections. It is the decision to stop measuring your worth by the valuation of the people who are trying to harm you, and start measuring it by what you are actually capable of when you give yourself permission to think clearly. I look out at the water from the property I bought on the coast, and I do not think about my father-in-law very often. When I do, I think about the expression on his face in that hospital room when he set the check on my tray, so certain, so entirely settled in his certainty, so completely unprepared for the possibility that the woman he had spent 6 years dismissing had spent the past 8 months doing what she did for a living. He thought $18 million was the price of my silence. He never considered that it might be the opening deposit on everything he owned. Never underestimate a woman who makes her living finding what you thought was hidden. She has already found it. She is simply waiting for you to hand her the rest.